Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So this is part 3 of the series I'm doing on temples and Freemasonry. So in the last part we looked at the critical claims from critics that Joseph Smith just borrowed and plagiarized elements from a Masonic ceremony in the temple endowment, specifically some of the ritual, signs, gestures, hand clasps, format, clothing, and even the language as well of a Masonic ceremony. We looked at different apologetic responses, mainly from the church and fair, about some of the similarities, but also the differences between both ceremonies, and quickly examined the argument between differentiating between the endowment, the specific doctrinal teachings and the covenant, versus the presentation of the endowment, aka the ritual, which have strong similarities to a Masonic ritual. We finished by looking at some of the critical claims that some symbols in Masonry that make its way into the endowment also can be found anciently as well, going back way further than Masonry. For example, the phrase holiness to the Lord is found in the Old Testament. The all-seeing eye, the compass in the square, ritual hand clasps are things which predated Masonry, are not exclusive to Masonry. This episode will be continuing off the last one. It's going to be much longer and it would have been way too much to have squeezed into one episode, but we're going to be focusing on the apologetics and the faithful scholarship of 4 main faithful scholars who are quite prominent on this topic. Jeff Bradshaw, who I've done multiple interviews with, the late Matthew Brown, who wrote the book Mormons and Masons, Scott Gordon, who gave a good fair conference, and a BYU Studies article by Stephen Harper. I'm also be looking at LDS truth claims and what other people have to say as well. Now, in the previous 2 episodes, we did go over the critics' position quite a lot. So this episode is really going to be focusing on the faithful apologetic reconciliations to this. But I'm just going to start again by reiterating what the critics have to say. So LDS Discussion says almost every aspect of the endowment ceremony is taken from the Masonic ceremony, and I do not think there is any escaping this fact. While the purposes of the Masonic and endowment ceremonies are different, the similarities are numerous, obvious, and line up with the historical record that Joseph Smith introduced the ceremony just 7 weeks after being initiated as a Mason. If you strip out the elements of the endowment ceremony that are not taken from the Masons, we are left with a story of the creation, along with elements that are not much different than what is taught in other aspects of the church. Joseph Smith took the signs, tokens, penalties, symbols, washing and anointing, new name, and clothing from the Masonic ceremony and taught members that he was restoring the endowment that had fallen into apostasy. He says, however, the Masonic ceremony was a product of the medieval times. It has absolutely no connection to Solomon's temple, which even Farr concedes. Either Joseph Smith was knowingly teaching members that he was restoring a lost endowment to explain the obvious similarities between the ceremonies, or he was tricked by God into thinking that the Masonic ceremony was a lost temple ceremony. So this would be the critics' position, and they would be pointing out, like, look at all these similarities in the signs, the tokens, the penalties, the receiving of a new name, the clothing. And they also argued that Joseph and the early saints believed that this went back anciently, but we can see that Freemasonry really began in the medieval times in Europe, therefore showing that it is not of ancient antiquity, but of modern origin, and therefore the temple endowment is not a restoration of ancient rituals, but it is really just a spin on Masonry. Now, there are certain elements such as like prayer circles, which he wouldn't have gotten from Masonry, and a better argument could be made that the washings and anointings he could have got extracted from the Old Testament, but it's undisputed the similarities between the ceremonies. We're going to explore what Jeff Bradshaw has to say about Masonry, and I would really recommend the episode that we did going over the history and sort of the origins of Masonry, Masonry in Nauvoo, the relationship that Masonry played in the coming forth of the endowment, and other influences as well, particularly for the content and the doctrine in the endowment. But one reason for Masonry being necessary in the creation of the endowment, Jeff Bradshaw has to say in an article, that Joseph Smith once told the saints that the reason we do not have the secrets of the Lord revealed unto us is because we do not keep them. But as he later observed, the secret of Masonry is to keep a secret. Joseph may have seen the secret keeping of Masonry as a tool to prepare the saints to respect their temple covenants. In addition, the rituals of the lodge enabled Mormon Masons to become familiar with symbols and forms they would later encounter in the Nauvoo temple. These included specific ritual terms, language, hand clasps, and gestures, as well as the larger patterns such as those involving repetition and the use of questions and answers as an aid to teaching. Joseph Smith's own exposure to Masonry no doubt led him to seek further revelation as he prepared to introduce the divine ordinances of Nauvoo temple worship. So he's kind of saying there that Joseph Smith could have utilized Masonry as a teaching tool to present the doctrine and the covenants of the endowment, and his exposure to Masonry as well might have led him to have sought further revelation, and therefore act as a way for him to introduce and present the endowment to the saints. He continues, he says, Samuel M. Brown has argued that Joseph Smith appropriated and translated selected elements of Freemasonry into the temple teachings and practices that he introduced to the saints. We might see the revelatory process, at least in some cases, not primarily as a translation of elements of Masonic ritual into Mormon temple ordinances, but rather as a translation of revealed truths, components of temple ordinances that Joseph Smith had previously encountered in his translation of the Bible and through his personal revelatory experiences, into words and actions that the saints in Nauvoo could readily understand because their intuitions had already been primed by their exposure to the Bible and to Freemasonry. He says it should be no more of a surprise to Latter-day Saints if some phrasing of the rites of Freemasonry parallels selected aspects of restored temple ordinances than the idea that the wording similar to that of the King James Version was adopted in the English translation of scriptural passages from the Old Testament included in the Book of Mormon plates. In both cases, the use of elements already familiar to the early saints would have served a pragmatic purpose. And Jeff Bradshaw, in our interview, showed that much of the temple covenants are found in Joseph's revelatory production, the Book of Moses, containing 5 of the covenants throughout its narrative, which was, I think, certainly an influence for the temple endowment, as well as containing some of the doctrines about creation, the fall, and the pre-existence. And he's saying that similarly to Joseph in his revelatory productions or in his translation of the Book of Mormon, drawing upon the language of the King James Bible as a way to present and articulate the revelations, that he's similarly drawing upon Masonry and the language and the teaching tool of Masonry to present the endowment, being both pragmatic and relevant to the saints. In a subsequent article, Freemasonry and the Origin of Temple Ordinances, Jeff Bradshaw says, the claim that rites were known anciently have been restored through revelation raises complex questions because we know that revelation almost never occurs in a vacuum. Because Joseph Smith became a Mason not long before he began to introduce others to the Nauvoo endowment, some suppose that Masonry must have been the starting point for his inspiration on temple matters. The real story, however, is not so simple. Though the introduction of Freemasonry in Nauvoo helped prepare the saints for the endowment, an analysis of the historical record provides evidence that significant components of priesthood and temple doctrines, authority, and ordinances were revealed to the prophet during the course of his early ministry, long before he got to Nauvoo. Further, many aspects of Latter-day Saint temple worship are well attested in the Bible and elsewhere in antiquity. Of course, temple ordinances, like all divine communication, must be adapted to different times, cultures, and practical circumstances. Happily, since the time of Joseph Smith, necessary alterations of the ordinances have been directed by the same authority that first restored them in our day. So he's saying that while Masonry was certainly a catalyst in the presentation of the endowment, it wasn't the catalyst for the creation of it. The doctrine and the ordinances and the specific covenants Joseph would have received by revelation, both in the Doctrine and Covenants and in the Book of Moses years prior. But he's also talking about that revelation does not come in a vacuum, and that Freemasonry played a part in the formation of the endowment ritual and presenting the ordinance. It wasn't just revealed to Joseph ex nihilo, and that the endowment was adapted and presented to the culture at the time, understanding the cultural influences and context that revelation is received. Now, of course, I think these apologetic interpretations or reconciliations could be dismissed by critics or unbelievers, and that they come out of necessity in order to defend what are clear modern Masonic elements in the temple endowment. There's no doubt that he is drawing upon elements of a Masonic ceremony in introducing and presenting the endowment. And I think the bigger test or claim, which will be done in subsequent episodes, is examining and comparing the temple endowment to what we can see in ancient rituals and ceremonies. With regards to the symbols and rituals of Freemasonry, their origins and were they perhaps passed down from cultures and religions before, Jeff Bradshaw says, despite Freemasonry's relatively late origins, many of its teachings and ritual components draw on ideas from the Bible, early Christianity, and other ancient sources. As it evolved, the movement was also influenced by the ideals of Enlightenment philosophy. This is supported by Robert Cooper of the Grand Lodge of Scotland Museum and Library. He says that Freemasonry adopted much Christian symbolism and iconography. Freemasonry doubtless used other sources and invented some, but the majority were adopted from Christianity. So although Freemasonry seems to date to its origins maybe in the 15th or 16th century, scholars believe that many aspects of the ritual and the symbolism and the iconography descends likely from early Christianity, and that Freemasonry adopted and repurposed them. But we can see examples of some of these signs, some of these symbols, going back in ancient religious ceremonies and iconography. Now, they do talk a little bit about the Royal Arch degree. Now, Joseph Smith, he advanced to Master Mason, so he did not experience this degree, but some people argue that there's more similarities between the Royal Arch degree and our own endowment. So this is what Jeff Bradshaw and Scott Gordon have to say. In the ceremonies of the Royal Arch degree of the York Rite, candidates pass through a series of veils and eventually enter into the divine presence. In addition, Christian interpretations like Salem Town's description of the 8th degree tell of how the righteous will be admitted within the veil of God's presence, where they will become kings and priests before the throne of his glory forever and ever, which is very similar to what happens in the endowment. Such language echoes New Testament teachings. Thus, apart from the specific ritual language, forms, and symbols, a more general form of resemblance between Mormon temple ritual and certain Masonic degrees might be seen in the views they share about the ultimate potential of humankind. And again, what we'll talk about in future episodes is how we can see a lot of those same things in some early Christian temple rites as well. Scott Gordon has to say the Royal Arch ceremony involves priestly robes and passage through a veil into the Holy of Holies. But before we make too much of these similarities, we need to remember that Joseph Smith was a 3rd degree Blue Lodge Master Mason, and as far as we know, never participated in or received the Royal Arch degree. There are a few members in Nauvoo who are members of the Royal Arch, such as Neil K. Whitney, but we have no record of Joseph Smith taking those additional steps. Additionally, the similarities of having priestly attire, a temple veil, and the Holy of Holies are clearly referenced in the Bible. So we've got no evidence that Joseph Smith went through the Royal Arch degree, and we can also see some of these things alluded to in the Bible and also in some early Christian rites as well. So the next apologetic, we're going to listen to what faithful scholar Scott Gordon has to say. And I'll put the link in the presentation that he gives at a fair conference, but we're just going to summarize some of the key highlights. So he talks about some of the ordinances which go on in the temple, such as baptisms for the dead, which are modeled around 12 oxen, which is likely influenced from the Old Testament, the basin in Solomon's temple. The second ceremony in the temple is the washing and anointing ceremony, where one is symbolically washed and anointed. This is, as recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 12. Thou shalt bring Aaron and his sons unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation and wash them with water. Thou shalt put upon Aaron thy holy garments and anoint him and sanctify him, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. Third, there is an endowment ceremony where through dramatization, one symbolically falls from the presence of God, makes covenants to follow God and Jesus Christ, and eventually return back to the presence of God. And fourth is the sealing or marriage ceremony, where couples are sealed to each other, where parents and children are sealed to one another as families for time and all eternity. How does this compare to Freemasonry? In Freemasonry, there is no baptism, there is no confirmation. In Freemasonry, there is no washing and anointing, except perhaps in one very obscure rite that is unlikely to have been familiar to Joseph Smith. In Freemasonry, there is no sealing. Only men are allowed in ceremonies, so the whole idea of sealings between men and women would be completely foreign. In Freemasonry, there is no concept of work for the dead. There are no ordinances that relate to salvation through Jesus Christ. Now, I know a critic might think that, well, Joseph could have gotten the washings and anointings, baptisms for the dead, from his reading of the Bible. Eternal marriage is not really something that's really clearly found, and this really does seem to be Joseph's own doctrinal innovation, or that he received through revelation. But I know a critic might think that Masonry was just another source that Joseph was pulling from his environment, that you can explain the temple ordinances by natural means. Now, this is what he says about specific similarities and also maybe some differences between the ceremonies. So, some of the ceremonial similarities, he says the endowment ceremony is presented as a ritualistic drama. Masonic ceremonies are also ritualistic dramas, so in that general form, they are similar, even though they are totally different dramas. The endowment ceremony starts with the creation and the Garden of Eden, and moves us progressively through our return to God's presence, while the Master Mason drama storyline focuses on the murder of the master builder of Solomon's temple and is designed to teach character and integrity. There are some short word phrases and actions used in the temple ceremony that are similar to word phrases and actions used in Masonry, but the Masonic word phrases and actions are not related to the themes, the teachings, or covenants made in the temple. Even those places where actions are similar, they have completely different meanings. Joseph seems to have taken some of the actions and completely repurposed them. And he also goes on to talk about, despite the very striking similarities between the endowment and a Masonic ceremony, many of the early Latter-day Saints did not have a problem with it and did not see that Joseph is just stealing from Masonry. Many of the early Latter-day Saints who went through the Nauvoo Temple endowment were already Masons, including Brigham Young, Willard Richards, William Marks, Hiram Smith, and Heber C. Kimball. They seemed to believe that Freemasonry was an apostate form of temple worship from Solomon's temple. Just as they had no problem with Joseph receiving revelation on apostate practices in Christianity, they had no problem with Joseph receiving revelation on how the temple ceremony should be carried out. They didn't seem to believe the temple ceremony was simply a Masonic ceremony. Yeah, similarly as they believe Joseph was restoring doctrines through his reading and translation of the Bible and producing scripture, or that certain doctrines were lost or corrupted through apostasy. They believed, because Joseph probably claimed, that this was some sort of an apostate endowment that was had anciently. So of course they're not surprised that Joseph would have those elements, certain elements from Masonry in his endowment, but the content, the teachings, the doctrine, the covenants, the ritual elements would be repurposed and have different meanings, almost restoring and repurposing those signs and symbols back to their ancient form. Scott Gordon speaks of this repurposing of symbols as something we see in the Old Testament. Through time, God has also used various methods or signs to represent the making of covenants. We have such as circumcision or the rainbow after Noah's flood. The blood that was put on the doorpost in Exodus was also a token, or Captain Moroni renting his garments as a token or covenant of them not forsaking God. Many of these practices, such as circumcision, existed in the culture and were then repurposed. So we see examples anciently of different actions being symbols or tokens of things, and also that things such as circumcision existed in the culture, but then they were repurposed as part of a covenant. So one question he answers, the question is, did Joseph Smith simply believe something was ancient that was really modern and copy that into a fake temple ceremony? He replies, no, even if you strip out all of the elements that overlap with Masonry, the temple ceremony is surprisingly in alignment with ancient temples. The Lord wanted to give us a gift or endowment. He directed Joseph to create a ceremony where we would make covenants with God and receive promised blessings. The teachings, covenants, and promises within that temple ceremony do not come from Masonry. But you could argue that he could have just gotten that from the Bible, from the Book of Moses and Book of Abraham, and you could even believe that those are productions of Joseph naturally. He says, in conclusion, Masonry focuses on man's relationship to man, while the temple endowment focuses on man's relationship to God. While there may be some passing similarities between some Masonic rituals and the temple ritual of the endowment, the teachings, the covenants, and the purposes are completely different. Now, putting on my skeptical hat, if we believe that Joseph Smith, let's just say, was a fraud and made this up, of course he wouldn't just completely plagiarize the Masonic ceremony. That would make no sense. He would obviously take elements but then adapt it according to his own doctrine and his own teachings. But the real question is, can we see any evidence of these things going back anciently? This is what Scott Gordon has to say. Early saints believed that both Freemasonry and the Temple Endowment came from ancient temple rituals. Hugh Nibley, Stephen Ricks, Matthew Brown, and Jeff Bradshaw have done work showing ties between what is done in modern temples and ancient temples. As for the ancient origin of Masonry, Greg Carney simply states that many symbols within Masonry predate Freemasonry. It is possible that some aspects of the Masonic rites were fashioned after some ancient temple themes. There is still much disagreement on the source of Masonic rituals, whether they are ancient or relatively modern. Many historians today believe the rituals were created in the 17th century, but there is clearly a biblical influence. So he's acknowledging the work of past faithful scholars, connecting some of the rituals in Masonry to ancient temple themes and rituals, and that there could have been this passing down over time of Freemasonry borrowing or repurposing some of those rituals and symbols. However, he seems like he's also open to Masonry maybe just being a modern creation and not going back anciently. His conclusion between comparing the endowment ceremony and a Masonic ceremony, he says, while there are a few similarities, the entire purpose and intent is different. Instead of believing that Joseph copied the ceremony from the Masons, it makes much more sense to say that Joseph received the promises and covenants of the temple from God and from the scriptures, but he also adapted and repurposed some things he was exposed to in Masonry to assist in that temple ceremony. Whether those few repurposed Masonic elements are of ancient or modern origin, I will leave up to you. So he's very much differentiating between the endowment, specifically the doctrine, the teachings, the covenants, versus the presentation of the endowment or the ritual drama in which the endowment is presented and that we participate in. And the ritual drama and some of the ritualistic elements clearly having direct ties to a Masonic ceremony. And of course, critics could still believe that the covenants and the doctrine could have just been Joseph's own invention, coming from his own scripture or revelation. So this is not a sign that it is inspired. And obviously there is faith in that part where what you attribute to be the source for those doctrine and those covenants, which are revealed in the temple endowment. But he seems to be remaining somewhat neutral, whether or not believing that some of those Masonic elements go back anciently or if they are modern. So Steve Harper has to say next. He has an article, Freemasonry and the Latter-day Saint Temple Endowment Ceremony. He writes, Joseph likely pondered the fraternal ceremony as he contemplated how he could best prepare his followers for what awaited them in the new temple, how he might best teach them what he learned over time from angels, as angels had done with him and he had done with his followers before. He started with what he had and used what the saints found familiar to lead them to further light and knowledge. So this is a similar argument that Joseph Smith is using Masonry as a teaching tool and something familiar to the saints to present the light and the temple themes and doctrine which he had received earlier. He continues, modern day observers may wonder what accounts for the similarities if the temple is part of a restoration of divine ordinances. The question can be perplexing to those who begin with an unfounded assumption. It goes something like this. If Joseph Smith restored truth from God, he did it without reference to anything in his environment. But what if that is wrong? What if the divine restoration was not wholly new, but like the restoration of an old house, where the restorer keeps all that's useful and charming and replaces or refurbishes all that's broken, weak, or no longer useful? In that case, there are more possible explanations for the similarities. Interesting. So again, he's talking about how revelation does not happen in a vacuum, that certainly prophets are influenced by things in their environment, and they play a role as well in presenting revelation, and that Joseph, as a restorer, keeping those things which are useful in a Masonic ceremony, which are appropriate, you could say, and then changing or discarding what is not. And that restoring being both things ancient and also things modern, things new as well, as one explanation for the similarities in the ceremony. Steve Harper also goes on to ask, did primitive temple rituals later to be restored by Joseph Smith get incorporated into Freemasonry? Or did Joseph Smith incorporate elements of Freemasonry into the ordinances he offered? Or rejecting a possible false dilemma, is the answer some of each? There is no way to know for sure. though some have assumed that they know. Yeah, that's kind of the question, like, is Masonry, is this some apostate form of ancient rituals, perhaps coming from early Christianity, and the ritual elements and signs going back to early Christianity, which Joseph is restoring? Or is Masonry just used in the presentation of the ordinance? But I think the issue I have with that apologetic is because of the claims which Joseph made about these things going back anciently in many of the early Latter-day Saints. But could it be a combination of both modern and ancient elements, correspondences to what we can see in ancient religious rites and ceremonies, but also Joseph heavily utilizing the method of Freemasonry, this ritual drama, in the presentation? Maybe it's not an either or, but could be both. He goes on to say that saying that the endowment was just derived from Masonry is also problematic, as some aspects and elements of Masonry are seen in ancient antiquity, and it also doesn't account for the differences between both ceremonies. He says that Masonic rituals use aprons, door knockings, and unusual handshakes to foster brotherhood. Bonds are made between men, not between people and God. LDS temple ordinances endow believers with power to regain the presence of God as they make and keep covenants with Him. The ritual is not the endowment of power itself. It may be that some ritual forms were adapted from Masonic traditions, but the endowment teaches a divine plan of creation, fall, and redemption. Very much differentiating that the ritual aspects of the endowment is not the endowment. It is the story and the teachings of creation, fall, and atonement about this covenant journey, returning back to God, and the specific covenants that we make. But also leaving the door open that some of those elements and parts of the rituals of Freemasonry we can see going back in ancient times. The next faithful scholar is the late Matthew Brown, and he has a great book, Mormons and Masons, which I'm currently reading, and he speaks about the differences between both ceremonies. He says that the endowment points to Christ, proxy work, sealings, washings, and anointings, and it's more based upon the Bible. He says that the Masonic author Neville Cryer believed Masonry and its signs and gestures likely came from Christian monks, and that it's rooted in monastic worship. In page 43 of his book, Matthew Brown says, Orthodox Christianity is the place to start looking when it comes to the question of Masonic origins. The Encyclopedia of Britannica goes so far as to state that until the Grand Lodge of 1717 AD, Freemasonry was wholly Christian in nature. Robert Cooper says, Freemasonry adopted much Christian symbolism and iconography. Freemasonry doubtless used other sources and invented some, but the majority were adopted from Christianity. How far did the borrowing of the Masons extend? According to John Hamill, none of the symbolism employed in Masonry is peculiar to Freemasonry. It has all been borrowed. With this perspective in mind, it seems prudent to look at Orthodox Christianity as the source for the setting and practices of the Freemasons. Agreeing with the earlier quotes that the symbols and the rituals of Freemasonry descended and were likely borrowed and adopted from early Christianity, which is what scholars believe. They weren't just created in medieval times. He continues on the relationship between Masonry and Christianity. Those who are familiar with the initiation rites of Freemasonry cannot fail to recognize the parallels between this Orthodox Christian ritual and that used for the induction of speculative Masons. Indeed, the further back in time one looks, the closer connections between Masons and the Christian faith becomes. So he's arguing that many of the Masonic rituals, the signs, the tokens, the gestures descend from Christianity in ancient religions, culture, and art as well. Dr. Mark Rivera, Latter-day Saint and Mason, says, there are those who would say that the very existence of ritual gestures in the LDS temple ceremony raises suspicions of some Masonic origin. One may find ritual postures and gestures illustrated within the art of many religious and spiritual groups across the earth and through centuries. For example, in Egyptian sacred artwork, one may see what seem to be ceremonial postures and gestures. Some people have claimed that these seem similar to postures and gestures found in LDS temple ceremony. Another example is dozens of symbolic gestures or mudras are to be found within the religious traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Some people have claimed that some of these seem similar to gestures in the LDS temple ceremony, yet it is obviously senseless to claim that Joseph stole his temple ceremonies from the ancient Egyptians. Again, arguing that Many of the signs and postures and gestures that we have in our temple endowment, we can see in ancient cultures and ancient religions and ceremonies and in art as well. And obviously, we don't believe that Joseph Smith could have had access to those sources. So many of these signs and rituals aren't just exclusive to a Masonic ceremony. And that's what we're going to really dive into more in subsequent episodes. Mark Rivera goes on to talk about the relationship between Masonry and the endowment. He says, I believe that Joseph Smith's Masonic initiation was the sort of catalyst and event that prepared Smith's mind to receive major temple related revelation that he had been awaiting for over a year. Smith's Masonic initiation provided him with a sort of ritual vocabulary. The experience of Masonic initiation prepared Smith's mind to receive through revelation an extensive body of ritual for the LDS temple endowment. However, the one was not stolen from the other. A direct comparison of important aspects of the Masonic rituals of initiation within the LDS temple endowment ceremony is highly instructive. Yeah, so arguing that Masonry is acting as like this ritualistic vocabulary for Joseph Smith in introducing and practicing the endowment, and also helping enable to receive the revelation of how to present this, and not that it is stealing, but it is a repurposing and adopting of the rituals and signs in Masonry. But I really like what Brett McDonald has to say about the similarities by comparing the Masonic ceremony to our temple endowment ceremony, and check out my interview I did with him, and his channel is really good, LDS Truth Claims. He says, while there are clear parallels between Masonry and the endowment, these should not be exaggerated. Even if one believes that Joseph Smith created the endowment as opposed to restoring an ancient rite through revelation, it is inaccurate to say that he copied or plagiarized Masonic ceremonies. Certainly, the endowment has a Masonic-like style, and he selected features of the endowment, and selected features of the endowment are identical to features of a Masonic ceremony. But the endowment is a distinctive creation. He goes on to talk about some of the identical or very similar features. Some of them being 5 points of fellowship and the penalties invoked in the non-disclosure of oaths, which were removed in 1990. 2 grips or tokens, the symbols of the compass and the square. Phrases such as has it a name. Using a set script and similar language. Imparting of signs, grips, and passwords to initiates. Vowing not to reveal ceremonial secrets, repeating orders and reports 2 or 3 times, and knocking 3 times at an entrance. I think it is important to be aware of there are some just undeniable similarities. The dependence is clear between a Masonic ceremony and the LDS endowment ceremony. To say there would be no relationship would just be nonsensical. However, the differences in the purposes shouldn't be overlooked either. Brett's conclusion on Masonry and the Temple Endowment, he says the endowment is better understood as a response to Masonry than as a mere imitation of it. Within the endowment, Joseph Smith gave the saints a Masonic-style ritual, rich in biblical symbolism and structured around a narrative of creation, fall, and progression to God's presence. Compared to Masonry, Joseph's ritual was more scriptural, more accessible, more community-focused, more egalitarian, and more ambitious, a ritual to bring the saints into fellowship with the gods. I like what Kenneth Godfrey has to say. This is from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism about just going over the differences between both ceremonies. Resemblance between the 2 rituals are limited to a small proportion of actions and words. Indeed, some might find that the LDS endowment has more similarities with the pyramid texts and the Coptic documents than with Freemasonry. Even where the 2 rituals share symbolism, the fabric of meanings is different. In addition to creation and life themes, one similarity is that both call for the participants to make covenants. Yet the endowment alone ties covenants to eternal blessings and to Jesus Christ. The Masonic ceremony does not emphasize priesthood or the need to be commissioned by God to represent Him. The active participation of God in the world and in men's lives is a distinctly LDS temple motif. While Masons believe in an undefined, impersonal God, everything in the LDS temple endowment emanates from or is directed to God, who is a personage and man's eternal father. The endowment looks to the eternities and to eternal lives, but Freemasonry is earthbound, pervaded by human legend and hope for something better. So it's really important, I think, to understand the similarities and the differences between the ceremony of a Masonic ceremony, the similarities in the rites, the signs, the tokens, the hand clasps, even the clothing, and both being this ritual drama form, but to also be aware of the differences of the purposes of the ceremony, of the content, the narrative that's presented, and the nature of the symbols used. And it's also important to understand that the early Latter-day Saints did not view Joseph as he is just stealing or plagiarizing from Masonry. They see him as repurposing and restoring something anciently, which Freemasonry had some aspects or elements from perhaps an ancient endowment. And really, we're going to be diving more into that in the next episode. Joseph did claim that these things were had anciently. I can't find a source where Joseph specifically talks about Solomon's temple. He does claim to be restoring, but that there is a repurposing and adopting of these symbols and rites centered around Jesus Christ and making covenants with God to return back to his presence and receive exaltation. But again, I do want to go back to what LDS Discussions, a critic, has to say between the apologetic of trying to differentiate between the endowment and the presentation of the endowment. He says that Joseph Smith taught early members that the Masonic ceremony was the apostate endowment, but we're being told that while it's from God, the presentation doesn't have anything to do with the ceremony. This is something the church would not be saying if research showed any link between Masonry and Solomon's temple, as Joseph and others taught. Well, I guess they would say that the ceremony is drawing upon Masonic rituals, but the actual endowment, the endowment of power, the doctrine of the covenants, is separate from the ritual. Similarly to like the ordinance of the sacrament, the ritual or the symbolism is the taking of the bread or the water, but we believe it's symbolic of partaking of the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and it's renewing those covenants, the specific covenants, which is the most important part. He says the church states as fact that yes, the presentation methods may have parallels to Masonic ritual, but the content of the instruction, the covenants, and truths introduced by Joseph as part of the endowment were revealed to him prior to his encounter with Masonry. He says, but if this is the case, why not provide the revelations that show it was given to him before he became a Mason? And I would watch the interview I did with Jeff Bradshaw because he was able to highlight, it was one of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Moses where much, I believe, of the revelation or the content of our endowment likely came. I do believe it came line upon line in the years prior to Nauvoo. But his point that, the church and apologists, they're trying to differentiate between the endowment and the presentation or the ritual of the endowment isn't something that you would do if you could definitively show that Masonic ceremonies tie back to ancient times. And I'm not fully persuaded by that apologetic that, well, don't worry about all the similarities to Masonry. And yeah, it doesn't go back anciently, but that's okay because the endowment is different to the presentation of the endowment. No, I think if Joseph Smith claimed that these things were had anciently, then that is a testable claim that we can't ignore or get round. And that also includes the ritual aspects of well. And the next few episodes will be really diving in and exploring that and researching that. And I think this is going to be some of the most fascinating stuff. Can we see evidence or traces or similarities on ancient rites and ceremonies across different religious cultures, particularly early Christians, or priestly initiations and coronation ceremonies to our own temple endowment? But I'd like to conclude this episode on Masonry, which is part 3, on specifically similarities between Masonry and the temple endowment, with what the church has to say. They say there are different ways of understanding the relationship between Masonry and the temple. Some Latter-day Saints point to similarities between the format and symbols of both the endowment and Masonic rituals and those of many ancient religious ceremonies, as evidence that the endowment was a restoration of an ancient ordinance. Others note that the ideas and institutions in the culture that surrounded Joseph Smith frequently contributed to the process by which he obtained revelation. In any event, the endowment did not simply imitate the rituals of Freemasonry. Rather, Joseph's encounter with Masonry evidently served as a catalyst for revelation. The Lord restored the temple ordinances through Joseph Smith to teach profound truths about the plan of salvation and introduce covenants that would allow God's children to enter his presence. Okay, so summary of today's video. And the church doesn't have really a firm or clear position. They're saying some people believe this is restoration of ancient temple rites, that Masonry was the catalyst for it, or that Joseph was just using something in his environment in order to present the endowment. Okay, so let's summarize today's video. So scholars say that likely Some of the rituals and the iconography and the symbols of Freemasonry are predated and descend from ancient cultures, and particularly early Christianity and monastic orders and monastic worship. There are differences between both rituals and ceremonies. Masonry is centered on a biblical figure, and it's more about morality, brotherhood, doing good in the community, whereas the endowment is more centered on the creation, fall, atonement, and our journey back to God, redemption, and exaltation, and making covenants with God. Faithful scholars believe that the doctrine in the covenants was likely revealed to Joseph Smith years prior through revelations and scriptural productions, such as the Book of Moses, where we can see 5 of the specific covenants that we make in the temple found throughout the narrative. And that Masonry became this teaching tool, this ritual drama, this ritual vocabulary for Joseph to present and introduce this endowment ordinance. There are some similarities between both ceremonies: wearing ritual clothing, some of the signs and hand clasps, the repetition of phrases such as "has it a name," or vowing not to disclose covenants, and certain elements such as the 5 points of fellowship and penalty oaths, which have now been removed. Now, critics would say that apologists are just trying to differentiate between the endowment and the presentation, because you can see Masonic rituals don't go back anciently as they claimed, but it seemed to originate during medieval times. And certainly the temple endowment, it's definitely a response to Masonry. It's drawing upon the drama, the presentation, the language, the signs, and the tokens of Masonry. And there's no doubt it played a role and was an influence in the coming forth of the endowment. However, what I'm most interested in is seeing, can we see any evidence or signs of other ancient religious ceremonies, particularly those of early Christians, that bear similarities to our own temple endowment, not just in the ritual aspects, but also in the doctrinal and the covenant aspects, particularly in the ancient Near East and early Christians. If we can, I think the critics do have a compelling argument, and all of the trying to differentiate between the endowment and the presentation of the endowment would seem to come out of necessity, because then we can see that Masonry doesn't go back anciently. And I think you could view this very similarly to maybe different theories that come for like the Book of Mormon, like the expansionist theory of there being both modern elements but also ancient elements in the text. Certainly in the endowment, there are modern Masonic elements in there, which appear to certainly come from Freemasonry. But can we find any ancient elements or aspects which seem to align with ancient religious ceremonies across different religions and cultures and rites and different ceremonies? That's what we're going to dive into next. It's been a long episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. Please give it a like. Please give it a comment. I hope you're enjoying the series. I'm trying to be as comprehensive as I can. I'll put links in the description. Check out the sources as well. And of course, come to your own conclusions. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.